Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we are going to tackle, a pretty big topic
Mm.
of the open society, and we're going to be looking at it through the lens of a book written back in the 1940s called The Open Society and Its Enemies
Right.
by Karl Popper.
Yep. Karl Popper was a really fascinating thinker, and his work is, I think, more relevant today than ever,
Yeah, I agree.
especially in our current
Well,
sort of political and social climate.
yeah, in a world where information flows so freely and you have so many competing ideas and ideologies,
Right.
it's more important than ever, I think, to understand like what makes a society truly open.
I think so too. And Popper was writing in the wake of World War II, so he had seen firsthand
Mm.
the horrors that can unfold when societies turn towards closed thinking and totalitarianism.
Yeah, so let's maybe start there. What is an open society?
Well, for Popper, an open society is one that's characterized by a few key things.
Yeah.
First and foremost, you have to have a commitment to individual freedom. And that means freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly.
Right, so people can express themselves without fear of censorship or reprisal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it also means that individuals have the right to pursue their own goals and aspirations, as long as they're not harming others.
Yeah, so it's not just about like negative freedom, like freedom from interference. It's
Right.
also about having the opportunity to actually do something with that freedom.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's about having the space to create, to innovate, to dissent, to challenge the status quo.
Okay, so that's individual freedom. What else? What else is central to this idea of an open society?
Well, another crucial element is a commitment to reason and critical thinking. So in an open society, people are encouraged to question, to debate, to challenge received wisdom, to not just blindly accept things.
Okay, so it's about constantly testing our beliefs and assumptions.
Exactly. And being open to the possibility that we might be wrong.
Right, so it's not about clinging to dogma. It's about being willing to revise our views in light of new evidence.
Right. And this is actually one of the things that Popper saw as the biggest threat to the open society. He called it the strain of historicism.
Historicism.
Yeah, it's this idea that history follows a predetermined path and that there are these sort of iron laws of history that dictate the future.
Okay, so kind of like a historical determinism.
Exactly. And Popper argued that this kind of thinking is incredibly dangerous because it can lead to a sense of fatalism. Like, oh, well, the future's already set, so why even bother trying to change anything?
Right, and it can also be used to justify all sorts of, terrible things in the name of some supposed historical inevitability.
Exactly. So for Popper, the open society is all about resisting this kind of deterministic thinking and embracing the idea that we can actually shape our own future through our choices and actions.
So it's about agency.
Yeah, about recognizing that we have the power to make a difference.
Okay, so we've got individual freedom, critical thinking, a rejection of historical determinism, anything else.
Well, those are some of the core principles. But it's important to remember that the open society is not a utopia. It's not some perfect end state that we reach.
Right.
It's an ongoing process, a constant striving for a more just and equitable world.
So it's more about like the journey than the destination.
Exactly. And it's a journey that requires constant vigilance and effort because there are always going to be forces that are pushing against openness.
Right, like those who want to control information or suppress dissent.
Exactly. And that's why Popper was so concerned with identifying the enemies of the open society.
And I guess this is where Plato comes in, right?
Yes.
Popper was not a fan of Plato.
Well, it's putting it mildly. He actually called Plato the first totalitarian.
Wow, okay, that's a pretty strong statement.
It is. But Popper had his reasons. He argued that Plato's vision of an ideal society, as laid out in the Republic, is basically a blueprint for a closed and oppressive state.
Really? Okay, I gotta hear more about this because, I remember studying Plato in college and, we talked about like the allegory of the cave and the theory of forms, and
Right.
it all seemed pretty abstract and philosophical. I don't remember anything about totalitarianism.
Well, on the surface, Plato's Republic can seem like a very, utopian ideal. A society ruled by philosopher kings where everyone knows their place and there's this sort of perfect harmony.
Yeah, it's kind of like a benevolent dictatorship.
Right, exactly. But Popper saw something much more sinister beneath the surface.
Like what? Give me some specifics. What exactly did Plato propose that Popper found so alarming?
Well, for starters, Plato was a big believer in a rigid social hierarchy. He divided society into three distinct classes: the rulers, the guardians, and the producers.
Okay, and so you're born into your class and that's it, you're stuck there. No upward mobility.
Not really.
Yeah.
Plato believed that each class had its own specific role to play in society and that trying to move between classes would disrupt the natural order.
Okay, I can already see how Popper would take issue with that, that whole emphasis on individual freedom and all.
Right, and it gets even more troubling when you look at how Plato envisioned the rulers would maintain control.
Okay, how was that?
Well, Plato believed that the rulers would have to use a certain amount of deception to keep the masses in line. He even went so far as to advocate for what he called the noble lie.
The noble lie. What's that?
It's basically this idea that it's okay for the rulers to lie to the people if it's for their own good.
Oh, come on, seriously.
Yeah, Plato believed that the masses were too easily swayed by emotions and irrationality, and that they couldn't be trusted with the truth.
So it's like a kind of paternalism.
Exactly, like
Yeah.
the rulers know best,
Yeah.
and they have to kind of shield the people from the harsh realities of the world.
Oh, yeah. I can definitely see how that could slide into some pretty dangerous territory.
Oh, absolutely. I
Mhm.
mean, it's not hard to imagine how the noble lie could be used to justify all sorts of abuses of power.
Yeah, I mean, think about all the times in history when governments have used propaganda and disinformation to control the narrative.
Right, and that's exactly the kind of thing that Popper was worried about.
So for Popper, this whole idea of the noble lie is like the antithesis of the open society.
Exactly, because it undermines trust,
Yeah.
it stifles debate, and it prevents people from making informed decisions.
And it creates a climate of fear, right?
Right.
Where people are afraid to speak out or challenge authority.
So for Popper, Plato's Republic is like a cautionary tale. It's a warning about what can happen when we allow reason and individual freedom to be sacrificed in the pursuit of some utopian ideal.
Okay, so that's Plato, the first totalitarian, according to Popper.
Right.
But let's shift gears a bit and talk about another key concept from Popper's work, this idea of social engineering.
Okay.
Now, I know that term can sound a little bit, creepy or Orwellian to modern ears.
Sure.
So how did Popper use it, and why was it so important to his vision of the open society?
Well, Popper was actually a big advocate for social engineering, but not in the way that you might think.
Okay.
He wasn't talking about some kind of top-down control or manipulation of society like we see in, dystopian novels.
Right, like some kind of grand scheme to design the perfect human being or something?
Exactly. For Popper, social engineering was about something much more practical and incremental.
Okay, so how did he define it then? What did he mean by social engineering?
Well, he saw it as a way of using reason and critical thinking to address social problems.
So like trying to solve specific problems in a targeted way.
Exactly. He called it piecemeal social engineering.
Piecemeal social engineering.
Right. The idea is that instead of trying to overhaul the entire system all at once.
Right, which is pretty much impossible.
Exactly. You focus on identifying and addressing specific problems one step at a time.
So kind of like an engineer would approach a complex project.
Exactly. You start by diagnosing the problem, then you develop a plan, you test it out, you see what works, what doesn't, and you adjust your approach accordingly.
Okay, so it's about being pragmatic and experimental.
Exactly. And it's also about being humble.
Yeah.
Recognizing that we don't have all the answers and that we're going to make mistakes along the way.
Right, so it's a constant process of learning and adapting.
Exactly. And for Popper, this is the key to building a better society. It's not about imposing some grand utopian vision from the top down.
Right.
It's about working collaboratively to solve problems in a way that respects individual freedom and promotes the growth of knowledge.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all fits together now. So Popper's vision of the open society is one where people are free to think for themselves, to challenge authority, to experiment, to make mistakes, and to learn from those mistakes.
Right. And it's a society where we use reason and critical thinking to address social problems in a practical and incremental way.
And it's a society that's constantly evolving and adapting in response to new challenges and new knowledge.
Exactly. And that's why I think Popper's work is so relevant today, because we're living in a world that's changing faster than ever before.
Yeah.
And we need a framework for understanding and navigating that change in a way that preserves our values and our freedoms.
And I think Popper gives us that framework with this idea of the open society.
I think so too.
So how does this piecemeal social engineering idea contrast with like Plato's vision?
Well, that's a great question. And I think it gets to the heart of the difference between Popper and Plato.
Okay.
Plato's all about trying to create a perfect society.
Right.
A utopia where everything was ordered and harmonious.
Right.
And he believed that the best way to achieve this was to have a very clear and rigid set of rules and hierarchies.
Okay, I can see that.
Popper, on the other hand, was much more skeptical of utopian thinking.
Yeah.
He believed that human beings are too complex and unpredictable to be perfectly molded into some ideal society.
And that trying to do so is actually dangerous.
Exactly, because it can lead to all sorts of unintended consequences, like oppression and violence.
Right. So for Popper, the open society is not about trying to create some perfect end state. It's about embracing the messiness and complexity of human life.
Right? It's about recognizing that we're always going to be learning and evolving,
Yeah.
and that the best way to solve problems is to do it in a way that's flexible and adaptable.
Okay, so instead of trying to design the perfect society from scratch, we should focus on making incremental improvements based on what we learn along the way.
Exactly.
I like that it's a much more realistic and hopeful approach, I think.
I agree. And it's one that I think we can all apply to our own lives.
Mm.
The way that we approach our work, our relationships, our communities.
Right. It's about being open to new ideas, being willing to experiment, and being willing to admit when we're wrong.
Exactly. And I think if we can all embrace that kind of thinking, then we can start to build a society that's truly open and just...
I like that. And on that note, I think we're going to take a quick break.
Sounds good.
So we've been talking about Popper's idea of the open society and how it contrasts with Plato's vision.
Right.
But one thing that's been kind of nagging at me is this, like, how realistic is this whole open society thing? I mean, sure, it sounds great in theory, but like in the real world, don't we always end up with some form of hierarchy or power structure?
That's a good question. And it's one that Popper himself grappled with. He wasn't naive about the challenges of creating a truly open society.
Right.
I mean, he recognized that there will always be those who seek power and those who are willing to abuse it.
Like power corrupts and all that.
Exactly. But for Popper, the point isn't to create a society where power doesn't exist.
Right.
It's about creating a society where power is checked and balanced, where there are mechanisms in place to prevent any one person or group from having too much control.
Okay, so it's about limiting the potential for abuse.
Right. And it's about ensuring that those who do hold power are accountable to the people they govern.
So things like free and fair elections, a free press, an independent judiciary.
Exactly. Those are all crucial elements of an open society.
But, even with all those safeguards in place, it seems like there's always a risk that things could slip back into,
Right.
a more closed way of thinking.
Yeah, I mean, look at what's happening in some parts of the world today.
Exactly.
There's this real backlash against democracy, against liberalism, against the very idea of an open society.
Yeah. It's kind of scary, actually.
It is, and I think it's a reminder that the open society is something that we have to constantly fight for. It's not something that we can just take for granted.
So it's not like a destination that we reach. It's more like a constant process.
Exactly. It's a journey, and it's one that requires constant vigilance and effort.
So what can we do then as individuals to kind of like push back against this trend towards closed thinking?
Well, I think one of the most important things is to just be aware of the problem. To recognize the signs of closed thinking when we see them.
Okay, and what are some of those signs? Like, what should we be looking out for?
Well, one thing to watch out for is this tendency to demonize or dehumanize those who disagree with us, to see them as enemies rather than opponents.
Right, like the whole us versus them mentality.
Exactly. That's a classic sign of closed thinking.
And it's something that's really easy to fall into.
Oh, absolutely.
Definitely.
Especially in our current, social media-driven world where everything is so polarized.
Yeah, it's like people are constantly being bombarded with these echo chambers that just reinforce their existing beliefs.
Right, and that makes it really hard to have a productive conversation with someone who sees the world differently than you do.
So what's the antidote to that? Like, how do we break out of these echo chambers and start talking to each other again?
Well, I think it starts with a willingness to listen, to actually try to understand where the other person is coming from.
Right, even if we disagree with them.
Exactly. And it also means being willing to question our own beliefs, to recognize that we might be wrong.
Yeah, that's tough, but it's important.
It is. And it's something that Popper himself stressed.
Yeah.
He was always saying that we should be our own harshest critics.
Right, like constantly testing our own assumptions and biases.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the most important things that we can do to defend the open society, is to be willing to engage in self-reflection.
Okay, so self-reflection is key. What else?
Well, another important thing is to promote critical thinking, to encourage people to think for themselves, to not just blindly accept what they're told.
Yeah, that's especially important, I think, for young people who are, still developing their worldviews.
I agree, and I think it's something that we can do in our schools, in our communities, in our families.
Right, like teaching kids how to evaluate information, to spot logical fallacies, to think critically about what they're reading and hearing.
Exactly. Those are all essential skills for living in an open society.
And it's not just about kids either. I
Right.
think adults need to be doing this too.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we're all constantly bombarded with information and propaganda these days.
Yeah, it's like drinking from a fire hose.
It is. And it's more important than ever to be able to filter that information,
Yeah.
to discern what's true, what's false, what's biased, what's not.
Right. So it's about developing our own internal BS detectors.
Exactly. And that takes practice and effort, but it's essential for being an informed and engaged citizen in an open society.
Okay, so we've got self-reflection, critical thinking. Any other practical tips for defending the open society?
Well, one more thing that I would add is to be willing to speak out against injustice, to stand up for what you believe in, even when it's difficult.
Yeah, because silence is complicity, right?
Exactly. And, it doesn't have to be some grand gesture. It can be something as simple as speaking up at a town hall meeting or writing a letter to your elected representative.
Right, or even just having a conversation with a friend or family member who's expressing, some kind of prejudiced or closed-minded view.
Exactly. Those everyday acts of courage can make a real difference.
They can start to shift the conversation in a more positive direction.
Right. And they can help to create a climate where open thinking is valued and respected.
Okay, so it's about being active and engaged citizens, not just passive consumers of information.
Exactly. And that's what Popper was all about. He believed that the open society is something that we have to create and maintain through our choices and actions.
Yeah, it's not something that just happens automatically.
Right? It takes work and it takes commitment, but I think it's a fight worth having.
I agree. And on that note, I think we're ready to move on to our last segment,
Sounds good.
where we'll explore some of the, maybe some of the criticisms of Popper's ideas and some of the, alternative perspectives on the open society.
Okay. That should be interesting.
Okay, so we've talked about what the open society is, why Popper thought it was so important, and some of the things we can do to defend it. But, like with any big idea, there are always going to be some, critiques or alternative perspectives.
Right.
So let's dive into some of those.
Okay.
One critique that I've heard is that, this whole idea of the open society is kind of like a Western-centric concept.
Yeah, that's a common critique, and it's one that I think we need to take seriously. Popper himself was a product of Western culture.
Right. He was born in Austria.
Right. And so it's understandable that his ideas would reflect that background.
But does that mean that the open society is incompatible with other cultures or other ways of life?
Well, I don't think so. I think the core principles of the open society, like individual freedom, critical thinking, and a commitment to reason, those are values that I think are universal.
Yeah.
But I do think that we need to be careful about how we apply those principles in different contexts.
Right. Like what works in one culture might not work in another.
Exactly. And I think it's important to be open to the possibility that there might be other ways of achieving those same goals.
Okay, so it's not about imposing a one-size-fits-all model on the world.
So it's about being respectful of different cultures and traditions while also upholding those core values.
Okay, that makes sense. Another critique that I've heard is that, this whole emphasis on individual freedom can sometimes come at the expense of social cohesion or community.
Yeah, that's a valid concern.
Right.
Popper was very much an individualist, and he definitely emphasized the importance of individual rights and freedoms.
Right.
But I think it's a mistake to see individual freedom and social cohesion as being somehow opposed to each other.
Yeah, you can have both.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, in fact, I think a strong sense of community can actually enhance individual freedom.
How so?
Well, when people feel connected to their community, they're more likely to feel safe and supported. And that gives them more freedom to be themselves, to express themselves, to pursue their own goals.
Right, because they know that they have a network of people who they can rely on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to find that balance,
Yeah.
to create a society that values both individual freedom and social responsibility.
Okay, so it's not an either-or proposition.
Right. It's about finding that sweet spot where those two values can coexist and reinforce each other.
I like that. Another critique that I've heard is that, this whole idea of the open society is kind of naive or idealistic.
Yeah, I've heard that one too. And I think it comes from this idea that, humans are inherently selfish and power hungry,
Right.
and that any attempt to create a more just and equitable society is doomed to fail.
Yeah, it's kind of a cynical view of human nature.
It is, but I don't think it's necessarily the right view.
Mm.
I mean, sure, there are plenty of examples of human selfishness and cruelty.
Yeah, unfortunately.
But there are also plenty of examples of human kindness and compassion and cooperation.
Right.
And I think it's important to focus on those examples To remind ourselves that a better world is possible.
Yeah, to not give in to that cynicism.
Exactly. Because if we believe that change is impossible, then we'll never even try to make it happen.
So it's about having that hope, that faith in human potential.
Exactly. And I think that's what Popper was all about. He was a deeply optimistic thinker, and he believed that we have the power to create a better future for ourselves.
Yeah, and I think his work gives us a roadmap for how to do that.
I agree.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the open society, I think it's important to remember that this is not just some abstract philosophical concept.
Right.
This is something that affects all of us in our everyday lives.
It does.
You know, the choices that we make, the actions that we take, the way that we interact with each other, all of those things contribute to either creating a more open society or a more closed one. And I think it's up to each of us to decide what kind of society we want to live in.
I think so too.
So let's all try to be a little bit more open-minded, a little bit more tolerant, a little bit more willing to listen to those who disagree with us.
And a little bit more courageous in speaking out against injustice.
Exactly, because the open society is not something that's given to us. It's something that we have to constantly fight for and defend.
It's a fight that's worth having.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the open society.
My pleasure.
We hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time.